Okay, it looks like we're all here. If you don't mind, I'll just do a quick roll call of the committee to make sure that they can hear and everything's okay, AAG Jones, and then I'll turn it over to you, okay? So Board Member Hart? Here. Board Member Straight?
Here.
Vice Chair Davis? Here. Board Member Cannon?
I'm here.
Okay, so I think that's the group. So AAG Jones, I'm turning it over to you as the hearing officer. Thank you.
Thank you. This is in the matter of NRA Paradigm High School. My name is David Jones. I'm an attorney with the State of Utah Attorney General's Office, and I've been designated as the hearing officer or the presiding officer in this matter today. Before I proceed, I'd like to get a number of matters on record and just some housekeeping manners. First of all, if you're not speaking, I request that you just keep your microphones on mute. I believe that allows for more clarity in the person that is speaking. Second, would the attorneys in this matter identify themselves and who they represent?
Yes, hi, this is David Martinson, and I have with me Lauren Sherman from Stoll Reeves, and we are representing Paradigm High School.
And I'm Brianquisenberry, Assistant Attorney General. We got Michelle Buse, I believe, is also here, and we represent the State Board of Education.
Thank you. Paradigm High School has submitted a request for agency action on September 29th of 2020, seeking reconsideration of a September 3rd, 2020 decision by the Utah State Board of Education to hold Paradigm High School and turnaround status for the 2021 school year. This hearing on the request for agency action is held electronically on today's date, February 11th, 2020, before a hearing panel comprised of members of the Audit Committee of the State Board of Education. I know we've taken a roll call of the hearing panel previously, but I'd just like to let the record show that all the members of the hearing panel are attending the hearing electronically. As the presiding officer, I will chair the proceedings and make rulings on any motion or any evidentiary material that might arise. The hearing panel will hear the testimony and review the evidence provided by the parties. The hearing panel will make all findings of facts and conclusions of law, and then make a recommendation to the full Utah State Board of Education. The hearing is open to the public and will be conducted electronically and as an informal adjudicative proceeding. The parties, through their attorneys, have previously provided pleadings and evidentiary exhibits in this matter. Specifically, Paradigm High School has provided the previously noted request for agency action. The staff for the Utah State Board of Education has provided a response dated December 12th, 2020, and Paradigm High School submitted a reply in support of the request for agency action dated January 4th of 2021. Paradigm High School will proceed first and will have 30 minutes to present its case, and we'll have witnesses available to answer any relevant clarifying questions from the hearing panel, as well as have witnesses available to provide additional information if need be to the hearing panel. There was a request by the attorney for Paradigm to reserve 5 minutes of his time for rebuttal, and that is approved. The State Board of Education will then have 30 minutes to present its case, and we'll have Utah State Board of Education staff in attendance available to answer any relevant clarifying questions that the hearing panel might have. And just as the presiding officer in these matters has the discretion in managing and making procedural and evidentiary decisions throughout the hearing process, the members of the hearing panel may ask at any time clarifying questions that are relevant to the matters at hand. And after the hearing has concluded, The hearing panel will meet to deliberate, make findings of facts, conclusions of law, and recommendations to the Utah State Board of Education. Those deliberations will not be open to the public, but the hearing panel's recommendations will be submitted to the board and the parties within 20 calendar days of the conclusion of this hearing. Before proceeding with the parties' presentation, I would like to address the documents that were submitted yesterday by Paradigm High School that were not attached to the previously filed pleadings, but which Paradigm High School has indicated may be used in this hearing today. Have the parties stipulated to the submittal of these documents to the hearing panel?
We have not. I'll respond first. So yesterday was the first time that I've seen these documents. I would just like to note that they have not been, they're not part of the panel's deliberation back summer of last year, or the board's deliberation and decision back in September of last year. They weren't part of the opening appeal brief or the reply brief. So I just at least want to make that known. And then I turn it over to Dave.
Yeah, and Brian, thank you for that, and Mr. Quisenberry, thank you for that. I completely agree. Those were documents that were provided to you yesterday. They were not previously attached to the memoranda. One, I really only intend to offer them for two reasons. First, there's a letter that was sent to you yesterday that I plan to reference just slightly today. It's the letter is from the turnaround expert that was assigned to Paradigm, and it gives her view and analysis. And I could have had her come today and given testimony, but frankly, in a 30-minute time period that we have, it just we wouldn't be able to get her testimony in, address the issues, including any questions that the board members may have. So I asked her simply to provide a letter, which we have given in lieu of testimony. And certainly, if you have any questions, or if the committee members have any questions, we're happy to, involve her and ask her to, appear at a different time and give testimony if necessary. The other items that were submitted are simply examples of some of the documents that were referenced in the discussions and the presentations that were made to the review panel. There are things like agendas for meetings and communications with stakeholders. So, and they're just examples. They're not intended to be offered as anything other than just exemplary things that were discussed with the review panel.
So I would say, since this is an informal proceeding, I'm not going to formally object, but just would request that this committee and the hearing officer just give it whatever weight that you would give it in light of when it was disclosed and provided here in this case.
Thank both of you for that. Finally, are there any questions from either party or members of the hearing panel regarding the procedures, or are there other aspects of the hearing that kind of are uniquely related to the electronic aspects of this hearing?
A.A. Jones, I apologize. If I could, would it be okay before we start the presentation just to introduce the people that are here from each side that are potential witnesses, in case any of the committee members have questions? I just think it might make sense to do that before we launch into the presentation. That would be fine. So quickly, let me just introduce the individuals who are here from Paradigm. And as I mentioned to the committee members, this is your hearing, and we're here. These individuals are here to answer your questions if you have them. And we have a presentation, but given the amount of time, there just isn't time to do a question and answer the way you might if this were some trial that many of you probably have seen either in person or got to witness via television. And so today with me is, initially we have Brad Blanchard, and he is a member of the Paradigm board. And Brad is here, and he's happy to answer any questions about the reason for this appeal and the impact that the turnaround status has had on Paradigm. Additionally, we have Fernando Seminario, and Fernando is the executive director for Paradigm. He was involved in all of the communications with the review panel and the presentation made to them, and is here to, he can testify about anything. If there are any questions you have about any of the facts or the discussion about any of that, Fernando's available to testify about that, and is available. And those are really the two people that are here. It's possible that Jared Conley will join. He's the board chair. He unfortunately had just a conflict he couldn't get out of. And so he may try to jump in. And if he does, you'll see him. And then also, of course, the Lauren Sherman is here with me. She's one of my colleagues, one of my partners at Stoll, and she's here and can help with if there's other questions that frankly she's smarter than I am and can answer for me. So that's our team and our group. But I want to be clear, if any of the committee members have any questions, we just would appreciate it if you just direct them to any one of us. We'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Mortensen. Brianquisenberry, would you like to introduce any of your witnesses or individuals that are here?
Certainly, just real briefly, we have Aaron Bruff, Tracy Vandeventer, Leslie Evans, and Max Lang, who are all members of the review panel from last year, are available, and then Anne Michelle is also here in attendance for any kind of technical questions that this committee might have. And then I have Michelle Buse, obviously, as well here too.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, Mr. Martinson, you may proceed.
Great. If I could, I'd like to share my screen now, and I'm going to try to do that. Hopefully you can all see that. Can you all see that screen? Great. Okay. Again, let me start by saying thank you for your time, and it's not my intention today. There's a lot of material to cover, and I'm going to try to go quickly, but frankly, I'm more concerned about hearing what the committee members want. And so if you have a question or something I gloss over quickly, please don't hesitate to stop me, because your understanding of these issues is more important than whatever I have to say. I also want to preface by saying that while Paradigm is challenging and is appealing, the conclusions reached by the review panel committee members, we find no fault in the work that they've done, other than we think that they've made a minor mistake with respect to the school. We recognize the hard work and the many hours they put into it, and aren't here to criticize them or to suggest that they didn't do their very best. We simply think that frankly, Paradigm met the criteria and should have been allowed to exit turnaround status. Let me just start quickly by telling you, Paradigm is a charter school. They were founded in 2006. They were one of the first standalone Utah charter schools. They currently educate about 380 students. It's a wonderful school. They take this very seriously. They do their very best. Now, they have a convoluted history on the turnaround status, and I'm not here to belabor it. I'm going to go through it very quickly because I want to get to the issues. It was placed on turnaround status in September of 2016. It submitted a school turnaround plan at that time for some reasons that are addressed in the memoranda, and I'm not suggesting criticism of anyone. During that turnaround year, the staff didn't review or approve the plan. The Paradigm didn't get the funding. There were no experts that provided, and the plan was never really approved. So, but Paradigm still went forward, and it got to work. It took this very seriously and started taking into account what needed to be done. While it was doing that work, the legislature amended the code, changing the definition of a low-performing school. And probably the board members all know this, and that this is nothing new to them. But as a result, Paradigm was removed from turnaround status in March of 2017. They got an email. This is a copy of the email. It just simply says that you are technically not in state turnaround at this time. Well, that victory was short-lived. In October of that year, Paradigm was put back on turnaround status as a low-performing school. And there's a debate between myself and Mr. Quisenberry about whether or not they should have been a low-performing school. Frankly, I think that's irrelevant. They were put on it, and they've been working their best to get off of it, and we'll talk about that. The notice itself did not state why Paradigm was placed on turnaround status. And I will tell you that from my view of the statute that's at issue here, section 53E5-301, Paradigm and the way it would have Paradigm evaluated as a bottom 3%, it was never actually in the bottom 3% of statewide schools. Mr. Quisenberry would suggest that it was in the bottom of high schools. I think that that's a misreading of the statute, and that there's a rule that was created that is inconsistent with the statute. But in the end, I'm not here to debate that issue because, frankly, we went into turnaround status. We hired an expert, and they have been working as hard as they could since then to get off of turnaround status. They submitted a plan. The plan was approved in December 6, 2018. Now, that plan had a number of goals. They're the kind of goals that I think you board members would expect. It was to adopt evidence-based instructional strategies, create a plan for new and experienced mentors, increase time for instructional coaching, create collaborative structures, and the goals go on. They're on there, and I don't want to belabor them because we'll talk about them as we get into what happened. Paradigm obtained immediate results. They were outstanding. The numbers skyrocketed up. They went up substantially in every metric that you could imagine for the school, almost every metric. But in 2008, for example, they received 92.1 out of 212 possible points, which raised their accountability score from 74.2 to 92.1. They also went from, if you were considering them in the bottom 3% before, they went from 737 out of 951 schools, so they went to the bottom 22%. They really saw very quick results. In 2019, they were finally given the promised turnaround mentor, education direction, and they started to receive monitoring from Observer tab, and they were receiving quarterly reports being made constantly. That continued to help Paradigm. Paradigm now, at the end of 2019, ranked 674 out of 960 schools. So they went from the bottom 22% to now the bottom 30%, well above the bottom 3%. Frankly, the school, if you looked at it today, you would not consider it to be a turnaround school. You wouldn't look at their scores, their testing, or any of that and think this is a turnaround school. They're just simply not in that area. Unfortunately, as we all have learned over these last years, and the reason we're not sitting in some very nice room, 2020 was a different year. COVID hit, testing got canceled, and this board, the Board of Education, had to come up with some new ideas, and it had to change what it was doing. And instead of basing whether or not a Paradigm should be allowed to be taken off of turnaround being based on its test scores, it got based on more of a subjective criteria that we're going to talk about, and what the review panel did. That criteria involved 3 questions. First, did the school achieve above the lowest 3% threshold using the 2018-2019 school accountability data measures? There will be no question about that. Mr. Quisenberry won't dispute that. It's undisputed that Paradigm absolutely met the first question. The review panel recognized that they met that first question. The second question talks about providing additional evidence of substantial progress, and we're going to talk about that when we get to that question. And then the third question talks about implementation of its school turnaround plan. I sometimes feel like when I'm telling you what the criteria was, that it's a waste of my time, because I recognize that this board members, the committee members who are on the board, were a part of these determining these questions. And so let's jump into it. The review panel made their conclusions, and they identified on the first question, they agreed Paradigm had met the standard. The second question, they suggested that the scores had gone up, but that there was not unidirectional growth. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. They also identified some concerns with the ACT percentage of students who scored 18 or above, going up, down, then back to what it was in 2017. And then you can see that right here. Then they talked about the percentage of students enrolled in Readiness course. Of course, that goes up. That started at 26%, went up to 46%, then dropped down, but was still above the guideline year. And then they talked about graduation rates were at 73%, dropped slightly, but then were projected to go up in 2020, and actually did go up in 2020. We'll talk about that in just a minute as well. So the question before this panel today is, was the decision to keep Paradigm on turnaround status arbitrary and capricious? If it was, then that should be reversed, and they should be allowed to be removed from turnaround status. In order to not be arbitrary and capricious, the decision must meet a few legal requirements. First, it must be fair and equitable. It must be supported by substantial evidence. It cannot treat similarly situated parties differently, and it must comply with the applicable law. And we'll talk about those things as we get into them. The exit criteria in the code, or in the rule, was much easier, frankly. It just said the school no longer meets the criteria for which the school was identified. In other words, if a school was in the bottom 3% and then it was no longer in the bottom 3%, then according to the rule that this committee, this board created, then they should be allowed to be out if they do that for 2 years in the second and third years. And frankly, Paradigm undoubtedly would have done that had we not had COVID. They would have gotten through it. They would have been just fine. But so the question then is, should Paradigm be allowed to exit turnaround? And the answer is Paradigm was placed on turnaround because it was allegedly in the lowest 3%. It hasn't been in the lowest 3% in over 2 years. It most certainly would have met the criteria in 2020 if the test had occurred, and it should have been allowed to exit turnaround status. But now we have to deal with these, what I'll say are a slightly more subjective criteria. Question 1, again, I mentioned this before. There is no question that Paradigm met the requirements of question 1. The review committee found it. Mr. Quisenberry doesn't dispute it. This is clear. Paradigm, in fact, Paradigm was the highest ranked of all of the schools that were evaluated for to get out of turnaround status. Now, in their brief, staff says Dixie Montessori was higher, and that's just not true. Dixie Montessori was lower. It was ranked far lower if you compared it against all of the schools. It was ranked lower than Paradigm. The fact of the matter is Paradigm was ranked higher than every one of the schools that was considered and allowed to exit turnaround status. It was the highest ranked on all of the objective criteria. Now, staff also suggests that Paradigm should only be compared to high schools, not all schools. And I'll tell you in just a second, I don't think that really matters because they're above the 3%, whether you look at it as all schools or only high schools. In 2018, they were 22% in all schools, and they were 11.9% of high schools. In 2019, they were 30% of all schools and 13.9% of high schools. And here's the most important part in that is they were the highest ranked of all of the high schools that were evaluated by the review committee. Now, ultimately, that whether or not you compare them to all of the states, all of the schools, or just to the high schools, it simply doesn't matter. So by the way, we'll talk about that later. Let's go to question 2. Can the school provide evidence of substantial progress? And the answer to that is yes. English and language scores more than doubled from 2017 to 2019. Math scores increased by 5% from 2017 to 2019. Science scores increased by 4% from 2017 to 2019. Indeed, in nearly every objectively measurable aspect, Paradigm showed substantial progress over the baseline year. And remember, that is the key. The statute or the rule says you compare them to the baseline year. Do they meet the criteria for which they were originally put into turnaround status? It's a comparison to baseline year, not a comparison to interim years. I can show you graphs that show the progress. I can show you graphs that show the growth. This is the language arts, baseline year 19 to 41. This is math, 15 to 20. Science, 19 to 23. And then here's one that I think is rather important, and that is that the lowest 25% of the students at Paradigm showed continual growth over those 2 years, from 2017 to 2018 to 2019. Paradigm took very seriously the turnaround plan and has done everything it could to make sure that it was meeting those requirements and improving its education so that it could get off turnaround. And it wanted to be off and has really done everything it could to get off. Now, Mr. Quisenberry will talk about some of staff's concerns. I'm going to preface them just slightly. First, staff was concerned, review panel was concerned that there wasn't unidirectional progress, that the ACT scores were not unidirectional, that students enrolled in readiness coursework wasn't growing as fast as they would have liked, and the graduation rates were inconsistent. Let me just talk briefly about those 4 items. First, there is nothing in the law. I don't even think Mr. Quisenberry will dispute this, that there is nothing in the law that requires unidirectional progress in order to get out of turnaround status. The standard is evidence of substantial progress, not evidence of substantial unidirectional progress. And that would unfairly punish Paradigm for its first year success. It had really good success. Its numbers went really high. But according to staff, If they had had a horrible or a good but not great second year, and then a slightly better third year, they would have been allowed to exit. But because they had a really good second year, and then not as good third year, they shouldn't be allowed to exit. And that's just simply not the standard. The standard is compared to baseline year. And in that respect, paradigm has gone up. I'll also add and touch on this with a graph in a little bit, that none of the high schools evaluated by the review panel showed unidirectional progress. But yet, for some reason, paradigm was solely called out for that lack of unidirectional progress. Staff next argues that the ACT taker numbers have decreased. And I got to tell you, they're absolutely right. The problem is, the reason why the number of test takers has decreased is because enrollment has been hammered by being on turnaround status. In the years that Paradigm has been on turnaround status, they have lost 170 students. And as a result, their number of people taking the ACT has dropped substantially. The percentage has stayed pretty much the same, but the number has dropped. Staff also argues that the number of students who have scored above 18% has dropped. Well, that wasn't part of the turnaround. That wasn't one of the things that Paradigm was encouraged to focus on in their turnaround plan. And that has fluctuated a little bit. But I would stack Paradigm's ACT scores against both of the other high schools that were allowed to exit from turnaround status. In fact, when you look at it, here's what the review panel showed. Whitehorse's average ACT score in 2019 was 16.3, but allowed to exit turnaround status. Utah Virtual, there was no score reported. What it did say in really excited letters was doubled their participation, which I suspect that's something to be celebrated, but the score wasn't reported. And yet Paradigm, which was their average score was 18.8, was left in turnaround status and criticized for their ACT score, even though it was the highest of all of the high schools that were reported. The next issue raised by staff is that the post-secondary readiness courses, again, this was not in the turnaround plan. This was not something that Paradigm had been encouraged to focus on. This wasn't even one of the issues that the review committee raised during their discussions. Had they raised it, Paradigm could have showed what was done. But one thing was absolutely undisputed, and that is that Paradigm has shown progress in it. It's not 100%, it's not perfect, and no one expects that from a school trying to get out of turnaround status. But its percentage of students participating in post-secondary readiness courses has gone up by 8%. That's what the review panel recognized. That's evidence of progress. That's not something that should be criticized. That's additional evidence of progress. Staff next argues that Paradigm's graduation rates aren't as consistent as they would have liked. And simply, that's not, they first say that Paradigm's rates are not consistent with the USBE records, and that's not true. What was presented to the review committee was an estimate because they didn't have the final rates yet. We recognize what they are now. We all know what they are, and we're consistent with what the state has. They next argue that the rates are inconsistent, and I disagree with that with one exception. I think 2019 was a tough year for the school, but otherwise, every year they've been in the high 70s. And then staff argues that they are lower than the other high schools that were allowed to return, and I'll show you a graph on that, and it's just simply not true. In 2016, they were the highest. In 2017, they were the highest. In 2018, they were still higher than Utah Virtual. In 2019, there was one minor step back by the school Paradigm. But if you look at 2020, based on the data that the school has received from the state, they're at 78.4% in 2020. They had a very good year. This is a good school that has worked hard and should be allowed to get off of turnaround status so that it can save this school and get its enrollment back up. The last thing on this point that staff argues is that the school accountability scores show a downward trend. And I just disagree with that. I think the brief that staff submitted is just flat wrong on this point. The scores are right there, 20%, 43%, 45%, and that's an upward trend. I think that there's the possibility that because the graph that staff used showed what the exit criteria was of 28.1, staff got confused and believed that's what Paradigm had done, but that's just not true. Paradigm has had a consistent growth trajectory in its turnaround exit criteria. It's a good school. It's worked hard. It needs to get off turnaround to save this school. Finally, question 3. Does the school have qualitative or quantitative data from the implementation of its turnaround plan? Is the school doing what it was asked to do in the plan that the Board of Education approved? The best evidence on this comes from the letter that I referenced a little while ago. It's their improvement coach. It's Miss Watkins. She has worked with the school for the last 2 years, and her assessment is this. In our assessment, the school has made substantial growth in addressing each of the areas of need. Over the course of our 2-year partnership, Paradigm staff worked hard to put systems in place so they'd be able to continue. I can't read it because the words are over. There we go. After they exited the turnaround program. Sorry, the caption, closed caption is going up, but I couldn't read those. The point here is, if you ask Ms. Watkins to come in here and talk to you, she will tell you that this school has done what's necessary, that it has worked hard, that it has made the growth, and that it's implemented the things that are necessary to demonstrate substantial improvement and consistent with its school turnaround plan. It met the question number 3. Here are the things it did, and I don't have time to go through all of these with you, and frankly, you'd get bored if I did. So let me just say this. This school has focused hard on each of the items in its turnaround plan. It's focused on student and parent engagement. It's had a 10% increase in active student engagement, a 5% decrease in off-tax and downtime behaviors. It's implemented standards that align with the math curriculum. It's got its staff, it's got all of its teachers coaching and training on the new policies, and where necessary, where teachers weren't ready to step up to the new rigor required by Paradigm, they've let some teachers go and have changed them. They brought in new leadership. They've formed new teacher collaboration. They have developed new coaching programs. They are working so hard. And by the way, the list goes on. The staff they administer state benchmark assessments. They analyze the data to make future decisions. They track student math achievement data. Did I tell you get bored if I went through all this? You are, I know. They go through all of this stuff. They have created new ACT classes. They have state assessment data. They have parent survey data. They have taken this seriously and have worked so hard because their school is dying with the students just going down and down every single year, because they're on turnaround status and students and teachers are afraid that the school could be closed. Here are staff's concerns. First, they decided there's no statewide or school-wide formative assessment program, that there's no intentional teaching, there's no school culture regarding data, and there's no communication. On all of those, I will tell you, I just simply disagree. Now, that's not to say that the review committee wouldn't want more. But what they did have is there. Now, formative assessments. Initially, let me say, that was not part of the school-wide plan. That wasn't part of their turnaround plan. But because of their size, they have an average of 17 students, and those students are tracked. The teachers conduct one-on-one interviews. They provide individualized attention. The teachers are working together. They track those students on Aspire to make sure that they're growing and learning, and they're assessing them all the time because of their school size. And even the review panel recognized that the school is implementing formal assessments, that just it's in the early stages. Here's an example, a couple of the examples. This is a formative assessment they use from Aspire. It goes through and shows how the school's doing in each of the topics. This is another formative assessment they use that's broken down by class and by individual. They go through and there's color coding to show what students are really struggling, who needs help, and what's going on. This is the kind of stuff that this school is doing. With respect to intentional teaching, there's just simply no support for this claim. The staff in their brief says over and over again that students were not challenged enough in math. But the only support from that comes from the 2018 needs assessment, which states that some parents are concerned that scholars aren't challenged enough in math. But that was the baseline year. That's not 2018 when the numbers went up, and it's not 2019 where they've continued to go up. That was a baseline year concern. And the turnaround expert disagrees, by the way. The turnaround talks about how the standards have aligned with math curriculum, the staff receives ongoing coaching, and that the rigor has gone up. The next one the staff brings up is school culture. They argue that this was a concern, a strange one for me. This wasn't brought up by the review committee, by the way, but they said Paradigm's assessment opt-out rate was 65%, which is a huge problem. Paradigm needs to show evidence of cultural shift to increase the number of its test takers. And I got to tell you, I don't know how Paradigm can be judged for the decisions of its parents to opt out of the test. This board of education has created a rule that allows those parents to opt out. And I don't think it should be incumbent upon Paradigm to force those parents if they don't want to have their student, if they want their students to opt out. Paradigm's ability to exit this turnaround should not be based on that. Communication, there was some concern about communication that wasn't in the plan. It wasn't part of the review panel's assessment, but I will tell you that this school has taken that as seriously as anything. They now have regular meeting agendas, they have newsletters, they have school-wide emails. Here's some examples. They use Aspire. Every student's parents can get on at any time to see how that student is doing, to understand what's going on with their growth and their learning. They have direct communications, emails, phone calls, parent-teacher conference. Teachers are providing that all the time. Paradigm communicates with parents and teachers. Here's an example. Here's an email that was sent from it's showing the example of what's going on. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to buzz through these a little bit. I apologize. I can see member Belknap looking very closely, and I wish I could let you see. I will email this to everybody. Here's a sample parent meeting agenda where the parents come in and they meet and they have meeting agendas. Here's a sample board meeting where they get the board together and they talk around the turnaround update and they talk about what's going on so that members of parents and teachers and public can come in and look. Ultimately, here's where we get. Paradigm has done what was required of it in the turnaround plan, and it was treated less favorably when you look at it on an objective basis. Their scores were better than the other schools. None of the schools had unidirectional growth, at least none of the high schools did. Paradigm's ACT scores were the highest, and its graduation rate, other than 1 year, was higher than Utah Virtual Academies. And I'll show you just on this point. This is the document that was attached to your brief, and it shows here's Whitehorse's growth trajectories, and here's Utah Virtual Academy's growth trajectories. I blew it up to make it a little easier for you to see, excuse me. Here you'll see that this is, Whitehorse had their numbers went up and then down. In fact, in 2019, their numbers were lower than their baseline year of 2017 in both math and science. And yet they were allowed to exit turnaround status while Paradigm was not. I've mentioned the negative impact, so I'm not going to belabor it. I've run out of time. Let me just say, this is a vital issue. Paradigm would not come to this committee and this board and spend the time and the effort to do what they have done if this wasn't a paramount issue to them. The school has literally, look at the numbers. It started at 637 and has continued to drop all the way down now to 380. The school cannot continue to survive, notwithstanding all the improvements that have made and all of the work that is done to improve its teaching, if it doesn't get off turnaround status so that its teachers and students can feel confident that their school will be there throughout the 4 years or 3 years that they're in high school. That's my presentation, and I'll reserve the rest of my time.
Thank you. Brianquisenberry or Michelle, yes?
Because I will be presenting, as an initial matter, all of the evidence and the data that you've just seen and just heard about, other than the documents that were submitted yesterday. The 10-member review panel considered all of that last year, took many hours, couple of days with presentations, and recommended, notwithstanding all that still Paradigm should not exit turnaround status. So something just to keep in mind. Now, this is an appeal, and Paradigm seeks to have this committee recommend to the full board that the board's earlier decision in September of last year be reversed. And so the issue here for this committee is to determine whether to recommend that the earlier board decision be affirmed or whether it should be reversed. And I want to start just briefly, and then I have some data and some graphs to show you as well. The standard that you're working under is called an arbitrary and capricious standard. That's legalese. What that basically means, according to Utah courts, is it's a reasonableness standard. Was the board reasonable back in September of last year in deciding to hold Paradigm back out of turnaround? Was it reasonable or not? If you find that decision was reasonable, then you would recommend that decision be affirmed. Now I want to share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay, Mr. Jones? Okay, I think you nodded, and I've got my blue cursor here. I'm kind of playing with that to see if that would help be kind of like my laser pointer. So let's begin. You have a 10-member panel, and here are their names. Michelle Eldridge from Provo School District, Susie Shearer from Ranches, got Leah Voorhees and Darren Nielsen, who are assistant superintendents. Tracy Vandeventer, who is a director at USB, Rebecca Donaldson, a coordinator, Aaron Bruff, also a coordinator with data and statistics, and Michelle Neal, accountability specialist, and Leslie Evans and Max Lang, who are education specialists. Excuse me, and Michelle Neal was an accountability specialist. So this was a very esteemed panel of education and data experts that reviewed all of the 6 schools that that were in this turnaround cohort, and this panel all felt comfortable with Paradigm spending another year in turnaround. Their recommendation to the full board last year was a consensus recommendation. Based on that, and then the board's own the presentation that it reviewed in September, it voted to keep Paradigm in turnaround on an 11-3 vote. Due to COVID, as we know, that impacted the statewide summative testing in the spring of last year, the board provided an alternative method for exiting turnaround, and that's where I'll begin. The alternative method involved 3 questions, and here they are. The first question is a gateway question. It's a yes or no. Did Paradigm achieve above the lowest 3% using 1819 accountability? And they did. If the school failed at question 1, then they would not have been considered for turnaround. And so Paradigm now claims that it should not have been put into turnaround based on its rank among all schools rather than just high schools. I want to talk about that briefly. So here is the turnaround statute definition for low performing school. And then here's the board rule for low performing school. And you'll see that in the statute, the definition is that for 2 consecutive school years, they'd be in the lowest performing 3% of schools statewide. The board took that definition, here it is, low performing school is 3% and added of the high schools statewide, and then segregated the schools from high school, and then the other group would be 3% of elementary, middle, and junior high schools statewide. It's undisputed that Paradigm was in the lowest 3% for 2 consecutive years. For the 2015-16 school year, with high schools only, it was 2%. And in the 2016-2017 school year, high schools only, it was 1.3%. So it, and thus it was appropriately put into turnaround. The critical takeaway here is that how Paradigm was first identified for turnaround is not the issue. The panel and the board last year were tasked with exiting Paradigm from turnaround. And the exit criteria is right here. This is from board rule, is that they would be identified in their 2nd and 3rd years of turnaround as being above 3%. In its 1st year and 2nd year, as Mr. Martinson has indicated that they were above 3%. That's fine, we don't dispute that. But in the 3rd year, we never got around to that data because of COVID. Now I want to discuss real quick why the board would want to segregate, kind of create 2 buckets, one for high school and the other for elementary, junior, and middle schools, because we have apples and oranges here. We have different exit criteria applied to the 2 different groups. You have different point values. For example, high school, they would take the ACT, whereas K through 8 would not take the ACT. So the board felt it would be efficient, it would be fair to segregate the 2 that way. And it's undisputed that Paradigm failed to raise or object to this being in turnaround up until now. They just mentioned it in their briefing. The Meanwhile, it accepted and used turnaround funds, a considerable amount of turnaround funds over the years that it has been in turnaround. And also, there's no contention that USBE applied this rule, the turnaround rule designation, unfairly to any school, let alone Paradigm. So there's no evidence of arbitrariness or capriciousness with entry into or designation into the turnaround program. Now, there was a brief reference to this email, the Cheryl Ellsworth email. I'm going to talk about this because it was mentioned that Paradigm feels like it came out of turnaround and then was put back into turnaround. And that simply that's not accurate. In this email, which was in March 27th, so this was about a month or two at the end of the legislative session in 2017. At this point, up until this point, actually, it was 1 year of below 3% triggered turnaround status. The legislature met, they decided to change that to 2 consecutive years. And so as of this date, there was only 1 year that Paradigm was in turnaround status. And thus, Ms. Elworth says, technically, you're not in state turnaround this time. But look what she then wrote. We will know if your school is designated by school grades that are released later this year. And the school grades came out later that year and showed that Paradigm was below 3%, and thus it had 2 consecutive years. Note that she also says, in the meantime, so while we're waiting till September for the grades to come out, we ask that you still comply with what you've been doing regarding turnaround. So this email is very appropriate, it's innocuous, and there's nothing here to indicate that Paradigm somehow had exited and then re-entered turnaround. Now, let's talk about question 2. Did Paradigm provide evidence? So we're looking for evidence, concrete evidence of substantial progress. So it can't just be moderate progress or a little bit of progress. We need substantial progress of improvement and growth. In addition to data and accountability system, Paradigm provides 6 data points in its briefing in support of this question 2. The first is right here. And these graphs that you're about to see, they come from Paradigm's exit request. This is also attached to the briefing. I have not changed or modified any of it. So this is kind of the raw data. So you can look here, you've got the 3 years, 2017, 18, and 19 in ELA, so English Language Arts, and the same for math, and the same for science. You can see clearly English Language Arts, there was growth over all 3 years. Math, you had growth from 17 to 18, but then it went down from 18 to 19, trended downward. In science, you can see it went up, and then again, it trended downward. So you have to ask, is this evidence of substantial progress and growth? Next data point that Paradigm provides is MGP, medium growth percentile. English Language Arts, clearly there's growth there, that's fine. But in math, their percentile goes up, and then from 28 to 19, it goes down. In science, it goes up, and there's some missing data here. So let me show you where we can find this data. This is another chart that Paradigm provided attached to its brief. So here is the science data that was missing in that chart I just showed you. So it goes from 17, 18, it goes up, and then from 18 to 19, it comes down. So is this evidence of substantial progress and growth? Next data point provided by Paradigm, and that's oral exams. So if you look on this side, you got 2017, 2018, and 2019. Excuse me. They were stagnant from 2017 to 2018 at 23%, and then it went up 1%, 1 point to the next year. And that's in oral exams. In their written exams, they were from 27 to 2018, 22% stagnant. And then the next year it went up 1%. So is this evidence of substantial progress and growth? Or is this weak growth? The next data point that they provide is a number of students that scored above 18%. So you've got, this is again, their own graph that they provided. It goes 2017 to 2018 to 2019 to 2020. It goes down the first year, then it goes up, and then it goes down. Is this evidence of substantial progress and growth? Or is this up and down growth? Next data point from Paradigm, and that is graduation rates. So this again is their chart. Here's the graduation rate row, and these are the schools in each of these columns. So over here, and I have to see if I can move that. Okay, over here, 2016, they were at 77%. The next year they went down to 72%. The next year they went up a point. And then in 2019, they went down. And this was reviewed, of course, by the panel back in the summertime. So there was no 2020 graduation data at that point. So going from 77 over 4 years down to 65, is this evidence of substantial progress and growth? Finally, the final data point to consider is provided by Paradigm, is the percent of students enrolled in post-secondary readiness courses. This is again their chart out of their request. 2017, they're at 26%. They go up to 2018, and then they come down in 2019. Is this evidence of substantial progress and growth? The trend, you notice here, the trend in all these data is that between 2018 and 19, the trend is down. Now, Paradigm criticizes this view, calling it unidirectional growth. The panel referred to it as consistent growth trajectory in the panel's recommendation. So you got to ask here, the key is, does this data show substantial growth on the rise? Is there growth? Is there an increase in growth as they're about to exit turnaround? Now, Mr. Martinson mentioned that there's you look at the baseline and not the interim, and based on statute. We're not talking about the statute here. Remember, the board has created these alternative questions to consider. And so based on that and the evidence that was provided, the panel had to determine whether there was substantial progress and growth. The third question here, did Paradigm provide qualitative or quantitative data from the implementation of its assurance? So we want data. We want hard data that also demonstrates substantial. Notice the word, the adjective here, substantial is used in both of these questions. Again, not just any kind of data, but substantial data. So let's look at what Paradigm produced. Here it is. This again comes from their own data, their own chart. This shows active engagement of their students improved from 26 to 36, about 10 points. This shows that the students off task and downtime improved, going down by about 5%. And that's it. So what data should Paradigm have provided the review panel regarding this question 3? Max Lang, again, one of our 10 panel members, he's also here today. He sent an email back on April 23rd of 2020, last year, to Paradigm's principal. He also sent a similar email to all the schools, explaining what the panel is looking for. So here's regarding question 1, here's regarding question 2, and here's regarding question 3. So Max specifically says, here's what the panel, what kind of data we want. He says, potential examples of this data include assessments utilized through UTIPs, LEA and school adapted formative assessments, mid-year assessments, Utah standards-based classroom assessments, and WIDA access assessments. Multiple examples of formative assessment data that the panel wanted to see. Question 3, Max continues. He copies and pastes this sentence right here, down here. They're looking for assessments from UTIPs, LEA, or other school adopted formative assessments, mid-year assessments, Utah standard-based classroom assessments, WIDA access, and then he goes on. Grades, credit accrual tracking, attendance records, leadership goals and activities, behavior incident records, PLC records, surveys, focus groups, interviews, action items implemented and presented through participation in LIFT. That's the kind of formative assessment data that was requested. This is back in April. Now, after this, Paradigm was given a chance to give a draft presentation, a practice run in front of the panel. The panel then gave them feedback. They went back and changed things, and then they gave their actual presentation to the panel. So they had that opportunity to provide this formative assessment data. Then they had another chance in front of the board to provide this formative assessment data. They provided none. Now, it's critical, this kind of assessment data is critical to turnaround. It allows for spot checking along the way. It's similar to if Chair Belknap is making a soup, and instead of waiting to after she's put in 10 to 15 ingredients and waited a couple hours to taste it at the very end, as she's putting in agreements, she would taste it as she goes. And if it's too salty, then she's going to adjust it. If it's too meaty, she's going to adjust it so that the final product is to her liking. Without formative assessment data, Paradigm is not working towards its goals. Without formative data, how do we know if Paradigm is implementing its turnaround strategies? Any system of goals requires data to show you are achieving these goals. Another analogy might be, remember, Straight he's at 200 pounds and he wants to lose 10 pounds a month to get down to 150 pounds. That's his goal. So each month to go down 10 pounds, presumably he's going to stand on the scale, look down and see where he's at. And if he's short, maybe he's going to change up. He's going to exercise a little bit more. He's going to eat differently until 5 months later, he sees if he reached his 150-pound goal. Here, it's as if Paradigm waited the full 5 months and then looked down to see where they were standing on the scale. Now, Paradigm criticizes this formative assessment data, saying it's not required in their root cause analysis. It's not required in their turnaround plan. It wasn't required by the turnaround expert. And so let's look at that. Here is a page from their turnaround plan. And this is strategy 4.1. So their plan had a number of strategies and goals and milestones. And it talks about right here, implementation of planned goals. Now here, indicator, improve school goal monitoring process. Data source, school improvement plan, 90-day plan, stakeholder surveys, quarterly reports. This is the sampling of the soup as it's being cooked. Create process, so the year one target, create a process for monitoring the implementation of school goals. Establish a quarterly goal reflection process. And then down here, action steps. Establish protocols for measuring progress toward goals. Establish a protocol for course correction if not on track. This is speaking about formative assessment data. Additionally, you had Max Lang's email that said, we need formative assessment data. They had a chance in front of the panel, they had a chance in front of the board, and nothing. Interestingly, and so Max's email clearly puts them on notice if they were confused on this point. Interestingly, the other 5 schools in turnaround, there were 6 total, they had no problem providing formative assessment data. Paradigm was the only one that missed the memo. The bottom line is the panel saw no protocols for measuring progress towards goals and for course correction because there was no formative assessment data provided. And that was a serious problem for the panel. Now, the final issue I wanted to discuss here is the comparison criticism. And so Paradigm says, look, compare us to the other 2 high schools, Whitehorse and UVA, and we were treated less favorably. That's arbitrary and that's capricious. And I'm going to look at that. Again, remember, reasonableness standard. Was the panel and was the board in its decision reasonable here relative to the other 2? So first, let's talk about the graduation rate comparison. And I think that is, let's see, right here. So here you've got, so this first column is, let me find it. No, this is a better one right here. Sorry. Okay, so this row right here is our graduation data, and this first column is Whitehorse, and the second column is Utah Virtual Academy. So let's look at the graduation rates. First, Whitehorse starts at 77% graduation rate. It dips down 67%, and then it comes up to 86 and up even further to 87. Is that evidence of improvement? Here is UVA. It starts at 42. It goes down to 38% the next year. The following year, it almost doubles up to 70 and then improves even further to 71. And as we've already seen, over here is Paradigm's graduation rate. So clearly a difference between the 2 high schools on the one side and Paradigm on the other. Additionally, and I'll finish on this, is the panel's report. So look at what is referenced here in some of the highlights from the data provided with Whitehorse. It provided benchmark data of its ELA scores that increased from 23 to 45. Benchmark data of its math scores that increased. This is formative assessment data. Student engagement increased from 72 to 89. This is formative assessment data. How about Utah Virtual Academy? It provided this NWEA data that showed continued growth in math and ELA proficiency. This is formative assessment data. And then in Paradigm, as we've seen, there's no formative assessment data. Based on the lack of Paradigm evidence showing substantial progress and growth, that's question 2, and Paradigm's lack of turnaround data showing substantial improvement, that's question 3, the panel's recommendation and the board's decision were reasonable. There was no arbitrary or capriciousness about the board's decision when comparing Paradigm to the other 2 high schools. This committee should thus recommend to the full board that its prior decision is affirmed. Now, my presentation, I took about 15 to 20 minutes because I wanted to save a little bit of time to field questions that you might have. And so that's why I have some remaining time left. Are there, and I know that Mr. Mortensen has 5 minutes as well on his time, but since I still have some time, are there any questions that I can address or answer that the committee members might have? And if you have none, that is fine as well. Let me exit, let's see, the screen sharing. Stop sharing. Okay. I don't, there are some hands. Okay, sorry, Member Straight, what is your question?
So is this just questions for you, or can I ask questions of anyone at this point?
I leave that up to Mr. Jones.
You can ask questions of any of the parties. At this time, I think Mr. Quisenberry is wondering if there's any questions of him.
Okay, so this could be a question for both sides. There seems to be a cause and effect that Mr. Mortensen made between enrollment declining and the decision to put Paradigm on turnaround. Is that as clear a evidence of that as mentioned by Mr. Mortensen?
You notice I didn't address that. I didn't touch on that because it is hard, I think, to be fair, to determine whether the declining enrollment is, or the number of test takers, what is the cause? Is it because of declining enrollment? Is that because of turnaround status? So I don't think that is as significant a data point to consider.
Can I address that question? I couldn't tell if Member Straight was intending that to be for both of us.
Go ahead.
So I will say this. I'll bet that the Board of Education tracks this, and I predict that I'll be right about this. And that is that for every school put on turnaround status, that their numbers go down. And that's because both students and teachers become immediately concerned that their job and or their school is no longer going to be there. And so parents stop going to that school, teachers stop wanting to work at that school, and the turnaround status has a negative impact. In fact, in the staff's brief, Mr. Quisenberry drafted it, I believe, and he certainly signed it. He concedes that turnaround status has a detrimental impact on schools. And clearly the enrollment is the largest of that, in my opinion.
And I would just add that that is not a factor or criteria to be considered with question 2 or question 3, because that would apply to every single school that's in turnaround.
Okay. May I ask one more question, Chair?
Yes.
Okay, so Mr. Seminario, did I say that right? Okay, thank you. What were the specific evidence-based teachings or instructional strategies that were implemented in your school during turnaround? And do you have any data in regards to that?
Thank you for the question. We did not have formative assessments as part of our turnaround plan, so it wasn't one of the priority goals. But what we do utilize always, even before turnaround, is our Aspire gradebook that tracks real-time progress on all state standards, and it communicates in real time to all our families. But at the conclusion of each school year, that data is gone. We don't have access to it anymore. So the sample that we presented in our presentation was a sample of data points that we can now track from the Aspire. That is the main system that we use for formative assessment data collection in our school.
So I understand quite a bit about this since I was part of one of those cohorts. I imagine you're cohort 2. I'm not certain, but nonetheless, another question. We were further back than you were, and we had our second year was feedback, was evidence-based instructional strategy, Hattie-based. So you're not certain what the evidence-based instructional strategies even were?
No, we definitely know what they are. We have a discussion format, and we have
what were they?
What's that? The Socratic method. We have training from the Great Books Foundation. We checked for engagement in the class and differentiated learning. We did professional development from our turnaround experts, and then coached on those things. We would go around and do observations with all our look for lists about seeing those strategies put into place, pairing off small clusters, those types of strategies. The email that was highlighted from Max, it didn't come till April. That was the end of the school year. So we didn't go all school year collecting data that we were going to have to present at the end of the year, because we didn't know that. We were working on our turnaround plan specifically. That's what we were prioritizing. And that didn't include what was asked of us at the end of the school year.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have one. I have my hand up.
Okay.
So your turnaround team identified in your prioritized needs and root cause analysis that the turnaround team needed to communicate about goals and progress more consistently and visibly with the school's stakeholders. Have you presented evidence of that in the packet? Because I'm not finding it.
Yes, we did. The plan, I'm sorry, was that directed at me?
Either you or
Yes.
David, that would be up to the hearing officer.
Fernando, you should answer that question, and I can elaborate if necessary, but you should answer.
The plan stated that we need to communicate to all stakeholders about the progress of our turnaround goal plans, not on specific formative assessment data points. So yes, all of our communication, we reached our turnaround goal because all of our communication included our progress on the plan, meaning when we finally solidified our coaching structure, which was in our goals, we communicated that to parents. When we had created a school leadership team, which was in our goals, we communicated that to parents. So we communicated all along our progress on the goals of our turnaround plan as was expected.
Okay, I have a follow-up, Chair.
Yes.
So from the documentation, it looks like 65% of your students wouldn't take the end of, or don't, or choose not to take the, in this case, the SAGE. What other metrics did you use then to communicate about your goals and progress to your stakeholders?
Because of our small class sizes, we know we have 17 kids a class. We know what they're doing, and we use direct communication. We email and talk on the phone with our parents weekly and regularly. We send newsletters about progress on our turnaround goals. We have the Aspire gradebook, which is updated weekly, and it shows progress on all the state standard objectives and curriculum. That's, the progress of the curriculum during the semester and how each kid is doing. We showed an example of one such middle school class. I think it was an algebra class, just to show that parents can see the progress through the state standards and the competency levels of the classes in real time.
So you're publicizing the Aspire data to your stakeholders?
Every parent has access to their own students' data to see their progress on their curriculum. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just comment on that?
Yes.
And so I understand that the parents can access their own students' data, but what we're dealing with here with exiting turnaround is school-wide data and school-wide evidence being provided. It's the whole school was identified as low performing, and the whole school is responsible for its progress and achievement. The whole school is trying to exit turnaround, and that's why I would respond and argue that it's more kind of global, higher 50,000 foot level data, formative assessment data that is required instead of kind of the granular student by student data that Mr. Seminario was just discussing.
I see hands up by Board Member Straight and Board Member Hart. Board Member Straight.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Seminario, have your teachers have data goals that they make at the beginning of the year and follow up at the end of the year? Did you do SLOs? Did you track those SLOs and the data from that?
We do have a structure in place now because of turnaround to have frequent collaboration meetings where each collaborative team does review student sample work and makes adjustments as needed, immediate adjustments as needed based on the target goals of, our school. Our board has our own data expectations and goals, which include typically about 70% or above proficiency on every content area. That's our main school goal, our charter goal. It's in our charter to reach those. And it was a part of our turnaround plan as well, which is why the example we provided had the 70% threshold line as our main target in every area.
Board Member Straight, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Is it all right, Chair, if I speak?
Follow up, be fine.
Yes. So do you keep any formative assessment data currently?
Yes.
Any sort?
Yes, we do now. Now that we have implemented the benchmark testing, that's all captured and will be a part of what we will communicate to stakeholders and part of our school process moving forward. We will also now take snapshots of our Aspire tracking before the end of the year, and before it's gone forever. We can track that and we will have that data comparison from year to year. We have also purchased the ACT Aspire test that we had done 1 year, and this year would have been our second, so we could have year-to-year comparison, but COVID canceled that. We are scheduled to take that again, and it's intended to be an annual test as well. So we do have that. It was just not in place because it was not specifically part of our turnaround plan. And so we prioritized all of those goals before we reached this one. And that's why we didn't have graphs to show, but that didn't mean that we weren't doing formative assessments. Every day we're assessing students. We have a dozen in each class and we know where they're at. We quiz on the spot all the time. We do whiteboard quizzes. I mean, our teachers know what the kids know at any moment and any time.
I appreciate that. So do you believe that it's fair to say that Turnaround has provided you the resources to help your students be more successful at Paradigm?
Absolutely, it has helped us with all the things that we didn't have in place that we do now have place. We would not have been at 30% from the bottom higher than all the other schools had we not put in practice what we'd learned both in my lift trainings that I participated in and with our turnaround experts and our turnaround plan. We would not have seen that much growth more than any other school if we had not implemented a lot of these great practices and utilized a lot of the resources that have been extended to us during this process.
So those resources are still valuable at this point.
We do not have any plan to step away from what we did. We will continue to do to utilize all the structures we put in place. Observer tab had mentioned that they monitor our whole progress and deemed us strong to make the transition out of turnaround. Our turnaround experts agree with that. We agree with that. We've seen the benefits of it. The hard part is that alongside that, we've also seen the harm that it's done to our school in regards to our good name and our reputation, our recruiting efforts, which of course is tied to enrollment, which is of course tied to financing. So it's created a substantial challenge for us to operate as a school.
Thank you. By my calculations, Mr. Quisenberry, you have a few more minutes if you want.
Thank you. Maybe just as a concluding thought, this presentation and I think this discussion is not intended as any kind of attack on Mr. Seminario or the folks that he works with. Just I reflect the same sentiment that Mr. Mortensen mentioned at his opening statement, and that we understand folks are trying to do their best, whether they're USBE staff or Paradigm staff. And so yeah, I just wanted to make that clear that there's certainly no intent to malign or attack or do anything kind of untoward like that. Otherwise, I'm just happy to answer any questions that the committee members may have. Otherwise, I have nothing further prepared to share.
Thank you. I believe, Mr. Mortensen, you've reserved 5 minutes.
Yes, and before I start, if I could just share my screen again really quickly.
Sure.
Let's see if I can find the right, there it is. Can everybody see that okay? All right. Really quickly, let me just make a couple of quick points. First, Mr. Quisenberry identified the individuals on the review panel, and they are esteemed. I would not suggest otherwise. But that's why we have an appeal process, and that's why this panel, this committee has been called today, is because you're asked to look and decide whether that's the right decision was made, and whether or not Paradigm should have been allowed to exit the turnaround status. And what you've heard today, I think, is that Paradigm, on all objective measures, was one of, if not the very best of the schools that were considered. And Mr. Quisenberry he spent a very significant portion of his discussion talking about the fact that they went up so substantially in 2018 that they had a little bit of a comeback in 2019 and questions whether or not that shows substantial progress. The issue isn't comparing the interim year. The issue is comparing to the baseline when they were put into turnaround status. Imagine, if you will, it's not likely, but if a school was in turnaround status and the very next year went to the very top, well, obviously they could never go down from there, or they could never go above that, and it would create a situation where they would never be allowed to exit turnaround status, no matter how good they did. That's what happened here. Paradigm had a great year, 2018, and they had a slight step back, but it is still vastly better than what happened in 2017 when they were put on turnaround status, and they shouldn't be punished for having a great 2018. And Mr. Quisenberry talked about, well, they showed the graduation rates for these schools were consistently up. He left off their test scores. The other schools that were let out did not have unidirectional test score growth either. Look, here is Whitehorse. Their scores in 2017 were 14.5, 9.9, then went down to 12.0 below the base year. Same as, and in their science, they continue to go down for 2 years in a row. Unidirectional growth cannot be the standard. Otherwise, at least 2 of these high schools should not have been allowed to exit turnaround status. He also showed you some of the other numbers where they went up a little and down a little, but there are lots that he skipped over where they just continued to go up and up and up. This school has grown. It's continuing to do better. It's not the school it was when it was put into turnaround status, and that should be changed. He spent a lot of his discussion about formative assessment, and I have appreciated the questions by Member Straight about that. You've heard Mr. Seminario talk about it. The board, the review panel recognized that they were developing it. This formative assessment is going on. It wasn't a specific part of their turnaround plan, but they have done it anyway, and they are doing it. And I showed you the different things they're doing there. They use Aspire. They meet with their people on a regular basis, and they communicate all the time. And keep in mind that Max, I don't know, the email that was sent that Mr. Quisenberry references, that talked about a lot of different things that could be shown, and formative assessments was only one of them. Ultimately, they did show evidence of formative assessment. They have shown growth. And in the end, let me just say this. Of the schools that you're looking at, on all objective measurements, on all of them, well, virtually all, Paradigm was the best. It was the highest ranked of the high schools. It was the highest ranked of all the schools. It had the best ACT scores. And while its graduation rates didn't go unidirectional, it was as high or higher than Utah Academy in every respect. When you look at all these things together, it's not a question of whether turnaround status has been beneficial to Paradigm. It absolutely has. It served its purpose. This school is not the school that entered turnaround status. They took this to heart. They took the additional resources. They worked hard. And now this school has developed and grown and is in a situation where it shouldn't be on turnaround status, but rather it should be let go again so that it can go back out and recruit without this stigma, and it can bring in students and educate them the way the state would want them to. The school needs it. That's why we're here. They could take the additional resources and continue to be on turnaround status, but they need to be off for them to continue to be successful. This was the highest ranked school, and it was the only school that wasn't allowed to get out of turnaround status. And that's arbitrary, that's capricious when you look at these scores. And so I would just ask you to please look at what was provided, look at the materials, recognize what this school has done, look at what the expert, the person who was assigned to this school has said, and let this school get back to educating without the stigma of turnaround. And if you do that, I'm confident this school is going to be one that you'll be proud of as a board of education for many years to come. Thank you for your time. I know we've taken a lot of it, and I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mortensen. And could you take back your screen?
I am. I'm doing that right now. Stop sharing. Thank you.
Do we have any further questions? Board Member Davis?
Yeah, I just have a clarifying question. When we talk about the formative assessments, that was a question during the presentations initially that I was asking in my head, well, where's the benchmark testing and where's the data there? So I guess I'm trying to clarify in my mind, were those things put into place prior to the September decision? Or were they put into place after the September decision? And to figure out the timeline of when the letter was sent that was requesting that type of formative data compared to when all of that has been implemented. And I think it's great that it has been implemented, but none of the data from it was brought for the December decision, and none of the data was brought today. So I'm trying to figure out when the implementation timeline, how that fits together.
So let me allow Mr. Seminario to discuss this, but I will say that it wasn't as robust then as it is today, but it was started. The review panel recognized that. They said in their evaluation that the school has implemented and is doing formative assessments. It wasn't as robust then as it is today. And so, but Mr. Seminario was doing it, and it was, and because of their size, it wasn't as formal as it is now, but they were doing formative assessment. But for now, Mr. Seminario, you should answer that question.
Sure, thank you. The three main ways that we did was we do in-class formative assessments all the time, just as part of our lessons, as part of our methodology. Dry eraser board tests, or things like that for the mentor, that we call it, what we call our teachers, to know how they're doing. The second is through Aspire. We make sure that our class course outlines all are aligned to the standards, and are all the assignments correspond with the standard, so that parents and students can see that through the course of the semester, they're knocking off the different standards, and we can take a snapshot of that at any time. I didn't have that in June because we weren't taking those snapshots in a presentable form, so I didn't have it for that, but that is something that we've always done. And the other thing that we started to do was the ACT Aspire test, but we didn't have comparison data because we'd only done it the first year, but hadn't done it the second year because of COVID. What we have done after the review is the benchmark testing. That's what we are doing now, and we've had great success in our first round of that. We put a sample of that, and we are reviewing the sample student work every other week as in collaborative teams, and making adjustments on actual student work in our hands, discussing with other teachers, and that's proving to be successful as well. At the time of the review panel, the presentation, it wasn't, the panel sent us a 10-item, things to fix, feedback for your presentation before it's final. Formative assessment or lack of formative assessment data was not one of the items that the panel presented to us as needing to fix or address before we sent in the final exit presentation. And the email that you referred to by Mr. Lang came in April of 2020. So we'd already done almost the entire school year not collecting in a presentable form the data of our formative assessments that we had been doing. We had been prioritizing our turnaround goals, which we've been successful at achieving.
Vice Chair Davis, if I could just add on to that, the date that I wanted to first point out was April 23rd, as Mr. Seminary had mentioned, and just wanted this one point. And that was one thing that was very disconcerting to the panel is after 3 years in turnaround, there's no formative assessment data. Yes, since then it sounds like it's being implemented. That's great, but that information was not before the panel when it convened, or from the board last September when it convened.
Remember, Davis, do you have any follow-up?
Could I just respond to that one point that Mr. Quisenberry just made? And I would, if you look at the reply brief that we filed, the exhibit that we attached gives the feedback that the school received from the state review panel. And if the formative assessment was such an important part of this discussion, you would have expected that to be the #1 item that was on there. And it's here. I know you can't see it, so don't even try. But I will tell you, you can look upwards, downwards, sideways, whichever way you want. The words formative assessment aren't on there. The school was not told that it needed to have this formative assessment. It wasn't a part of its turnaround plan. It wasn't in the comments that the panel gave it, and yet that's where they come down. On the numbers, the school's better than the other schools, but for some reason, the one thing that it wasn't told that it needed to present formative assessment. The panel recognized that it was doing formative assessment and recognized that it just wasn't a formal policy, and they put that in their review, but it wasn't one of the things they asked for when they gave the school its comments on the presentation and said, here's what we want you to prepare for the presentation. Formative assessment wasn't one of those things. And Mr. Seminario was honest. He's been very forthright. They did it, but the data disappears at the end of the year, so they weren't able to show those slides.
And I would just add, the other 5 schools had no problem coming out with formative assessment data. They somehow understood. Paradigm did not.
Board Member Davis, do you have any follow-up?
No, I guess not. I just, if the data isn't in a presentable form, I think nobody cares about the aesthetics really, but if it's not in a studyable form for the school itself, that's, helpful for a school to keep that data in a form that you can measure the progress. I would love to see a copy of that paper that Mr. Mortensen has. If we can have that sent to us, that would be helpful also. Thank you.
It's attached to the reply brief that we filed. It's the last exhibit, but I know that.
Okay, great. Then I'll go back and reread it. Thank you.
No, I know that. Anyway.
Thanks.
Also, I would like to just have my PowerPoint delivered to the board members. I'll email it to you, AAG Jones, if that's okay, and if you wouldn't mind delivering it. Thank you.
That's correct. I've got one point of clarification. Was your PowerPoint presentation also included in your pleadings?
It was not, but it referenced stuff that was in the pleadings. The only thing in there that wasn't in the pleadings was the quotes from the turnaround expert where she talked about what the school has done.
Okay. I see a couple other hands. Board Member Cannon. Board Member Cannon, do you have your hand up?
I do. Thank you. I would just like to have some clarification, please. It was presented that Paradigm had been designated a low-performing school, which I understand is a federal designation. Turnaround school is a state designation. And there was talk about how legislation changed and put in this 3% rule. And then Mr. Quisenberry gave us the 3% of all high schools, 3% of elementaries, junior highs, so forth. So my question is, what criteria, under what legislation and criteria was Paradigm initially designated a turnaround school? Can we know what criteria they were judged by when they were first put into turnaround?
Mr. Jones? I can try and address that. And of course, we've got the panel of experts here that can help out. Member Cannon, it gets a little complicated because we're dealing with three separate bills that were enacted. The first was SB 235 that was in 2014 to 2015. And the next one is SB 191. This, by the way, is on page 2 of the board's response brief. It's in the facts section. And so if you don't get all this down, then that's fine. The third was SB 234. So you've got three different bills that were enacted that changed and modified the requirements. That's kind of the easy, simple response that I would have. If you want more details, then I would probably ask either Max or Leslie or Tracy. They're the Turon experts to respond.
Yeah, this is Tracy. If I could just clarify for Board Member Cannon, the word turnaround means the same as low performing. Those names are interchangeable. People tend to use the word turnaround to distinguish the state identification from the federal. However, if it's a federal program, they are referred to as critical needs schools. So the low performing title and turnaround are interchangeable.
Well, so what would Paradigm's designation be then? Would they be critical needs?
No, they are within that state identification and can be referred to either as turnaround or low performing. Both of those titles apply.
Okay, so it's confusing. I'm just trying to discern here whether or not they were designated a turnaround school and then had everything changed on them, or are they working to get out of turnaround under the same criteria that they were put into turnaround?
Chair, if I may?
Yes.
They are under the same expectations from when they were placed in turnaround. They were given a warning that they might be in turnaround, and then legislatively there were some changes. So they were never formally placed in turnaround initially. And that is reference to Cheryl's letter saying, you are technically not in turnaround at this point, because they were waiting for that legislative decision to be made. Once that criteria was in place, then they needed to have that second year showing that they were in the lowest 3% of high schools, which they were then placed in turnaround, and they are now being held to the standard that they began with.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
Under the rule, they were in the lowest 3% of high schools. Was that designation also made with Whitehorse and Utah Virtual Academy? Were they also in the lowest 3% of high schools?
Yes, that they were, Board Member Cannon. And I apologize, I did not, for the record, introduce myself. I am the director of the Center for Continuous School Improvement with USBE. My name is Tracy Van Deventer. I apologize for not taking care of that earlier.
Okay, thank you. So the answer to my question was yes, all of those three were in the lowest 3% of high schools. All right, thank you for answering.
Board Member Hart.
So I would like to ask a question or two, and I did find the feedback, and the reason that the formative assessment data is of interest to me. I understand the concern about what's been brought up, but if you are a school that 65% of the kids are not taking the SAGE, then I'm wondering, where is the data that shows none of these numbers mean much when they assess less than half of the student progress? So when the feedback on the presentation says to include the N size and add the enrollment data over time, that certainly would have put the team in a better position to transparently see transparently the progress of students. So it's not a matter of wanting to see the formative assessment process as an improvement strategy. I'm clearly just struck by the lack of data on which to make a decision, and I'm still trying to wade through. I do see that you've put N sizes, but without understanding what the whole group size is, that is a statistical manipulation. So I'm just struggling because I see where there is lack of data and transparency, and it's hard to make a determination on your claim that the school is doing better when that data is not presented.
That was more of a comment than a question, I understand, but if there be
I'm wondering if where is the data on the students that did not take the SAGE?
Okay.
Is that for me to answer?
It'd be, yes.
It'd be great.
Thank you.
It'd be helpful.
We use summative data, which we presented, to show instead of the SAGE test. And we use the formative data in class during the school year to be able to track immediate changes that need to be made in the class in real time.
Okay, and not to interrupt, just point me to the direction of that summative data. That's really my question. Where is that in the presentation?
That's what that graph that had a lot of colors, that was a sample of it in the PowerPoint presentation that we sent, that we just did.
Okay.
There was one slide that showed how we capture the data from gradebook in real time to show progress on the state standards.
Okay, thank you.
And I can show that on the PowerPoint if you'd like, Board Member Hart.
Well, you're sending the PowerPoint, correct?
I am.
Okay, then that will be fine. Thank you.
I would add that the entire time in turnaround, the three years, we were never given the target data to exit because the test had changed and the criteria had changed. We went the entire time of turnaround never knowing what our targets were. And that's well documented as well. In fact, we're in turnaround now still and don't have any clue what our target is to exit in just a few months from now. We had to do the entire turnaround process blind. So even the data that we show would show a lot of growth for our kids, which is important, but wouldn't show progress towards any end goal that at least the states provided to us because we never had it.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Davis, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have one substantive question and then two procedural. I guess this just sparked my question. Where does the target data usually come from? I mean, does the state provide the target data, or is that something that's created by the school in the goals? Maybe that's a question for Tracy or one of the
Absolutely. This is Tracy Van Deventer, Director of the Center for Continuous School Improvement. And in the previous cohorts, it has been recently changed in cohort 4, but in cohorts 1, 2, and 3, they needed to perform above the other schools after all the data had been gathered. Then they needed to perform above that level. So you had to gather all of the RISE data or SAGE data to be able to get that information. And it was difficult. That's why those changes have been made. So now cohort 4 knows from the get-go what they need to get for their exit score. But it is true for all schools, all the schools that we had in this exit review panel, they were unaware of what that bar might be because they didn't know how well their peers would do in their own performance, right? So in order to exit, they needed to be 2 years above the lowest 3%. And we didn't know what the 3% would be until they had gathered all the scores. And perhaps Max can add more detail or clarity around that as well. Dr. Lang?
This is Max Lang, specialist for the board. I would defer to Aaron Bruff, who is available here at this meeting to explain the complexities of determining an exit target in the previous cohorts of turnaround schools.
It's complicated. Aaron Bruff from Data and Statistics. It is changed from the accountability system to the accountability system. So as state laws or board rules have been modified or adjust, that target, like Tracy has explained, it is a moving thing and very difficult to say, hey, that's exactly what we need to shoot at or reach for that target. In the initial stage, it was an increase in the grade, going from, for example, go from an F to a D. We found some statistical inconsistencies. For example, you could see a school that went from hypothetically like 20% up to 40%, but would only be would still be considered an F school, or you have another school that went from, like, for example, a 45 to a 46 and just barely got over the threshold. We looked at those, and so those adjustments were made again as things were moving along. So as Tracy has described, there are new targets now are getting in place where the criteria of okay, this is what you need to reach for on the exit status. Those are being put in place right now. Complicated. I don't know if that answers the question well or not for you, Board Member Davis, or not, but.
well, I can just see how there could be some questions or concerns there, and with it feeling like there was a bit of a moving target. And I think it can be looked at both sides. The targets provided by the state or the targets provided by the goals. I hope we can get some consistency there in general, because it sounds like that's needed. And I was just saying today, the legislature would get home runs from educators if it would just stop moving home plate over the field. And so sounds like, all of us need to be aware of that as well. Procedurally, my question is this, 2 questions. Are we, just making sure in my mind, considering evidence to show that the board made as accurate as possible a decision in September? Or are we considering new evidence or things that have been done from September to February to determine if paradigm should still be on turnaround today? Which of those 2 is our, I think it's the first, but I want to make sure I'm understanding that accurately. And
I'll
then
let the turn. Go ahead.
I can respond to that. So this committee's charge is to review the decision made by the board back in September of 2020, as we've indicated, for reasonableness, for arbitrary and capriciousness. So that's really kind of the end of the road, so to speak, in terms of data and information and evidence, because anything you consider after September was not considered by the board in September. And in a sense, it's somewhat unfair then to judge the board in September by data and evidence that they never were able to consider.
And if that decision, may I ask, Chair?
Yes, I think David Mortensen wanted to respond to your first question.
I'm happy to let Member Davis ask her next question. I do want to respond if I could.
Okay.
Okay, my next question was, if the decision of the board is upheld and not overturned, when is the next window to go through this process again coming? Is that in June again? And how would we do that without some of the data from COVID in the spring?
I would defer to our turnaround experts, Tracy, maybe.
Thank you so much. Now, I believe that is really up in the air, because we are currently waiting for a waiver request from the federal government in regards to the accountability that our testing that will take place this spring, what level of accountability will be included. At the same time, legislatively, for our state turnaround for these low performing schools, they are also in dialogue about whether or not the current testing that's going to be used this spring will be used for accountability reasons. And in fact, we're meeting tomorrow with APAC to go further into that discussion. And I know Aaron Bruff can maybe go a little deeper with that. So the answer is, it is unclear. So for cohort 3 schools, they are also wondering, because they do not know what kind of options will be provided for them to be able to demonstrate that they've had that substantial growth. The board did make the decision to allow us to continue in R277920. They did give us the option to come up with reasonable ways that those schools could present, but that definition has not been decided for this upcoming year. And Paradigm falls in that same category with cohort 3. So unfortunately, we don't have those answers at this point. Perhaps Aaron Bruff would have more clarity around that.
Aaron Bruff, I don't have more clarity. Just again, the sharing, what it is we're looking at all possibilities. Again, going to APAC, we've had the last 2 days meeting with our technical advisory committee, reviewing the assessments coming through this year. How are they going to be used? We can't calculate a growth metrics because of approval of, or the waiver the board's already given, where you have to have multiple years. So the questions that are being circled around are we going to look at the academic performance only? if that's the case, and how is that going to be applied? So again, more information will be coming, in particular from Assistant Superintendent Darren Nelson after the APAC meeting tomorrow. They will be sending recommendations to the board, and those decisions will be made. General statement, the COVID pandemic has thrown a wrench into not only Utah's, everyone's wheelhouse, if you will, and trying to figure through that, how's this all going to work, and restarts and such. It's very difficult. And so you go back to that first statement, if we would stop changing the measurement, we can measure the change, but we're changing the measurement. So it's very difficult to have that trajectory or, that even line going through the entire time.
Mr. Mortensen?
Yeah, wow. Let me just add to, in response to what Member Davis asked. None of the information that's in the slide show that I provided today, including the information on formative assessments, is information that's new, except for the only thing that we've presented today that's new since September is that one letter from the turnaround expert who we could have had come and give testimony today, but ultimately everything that we have done and everything that you've heard that's been discussed was something that was presented in September and that existed as of September. And I'll send you that PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you. Member Davis, do you have any further questions?
No, thank you. I'll just say thanks for answering those questions. And to everybody who's here from Paradigm, it doesn't help that a pandemic has landed in the middle of all of this. And so please know that we appreciate, the efforts that you are making, and we recognize that that is a difficulty in the middle of all this as well.
Any further questions? I don't see any more hands up. In that case, the hearing is concluded, and we'll have the hearing panel take a recess and go into another meeting that's not open to the public to discuss this matter. Chair Belknap, do you need to say anything as far as, or do we need any direction from you as for will the Zoom meeting be open still?
Yeah, Jerry will make sure that's open, but we will start that at 5:35.
Okay, about 10 minutes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. We appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you.